Hi, everybody. How's it going?
It's Friday.
Friday.
Friday. Thumbs up across the board. Yeah. Um, so this is our Domain of One's Own WordPress multi-site panel. We actually did a version of this at the live at the conference, but the there was some issues with the audio on the recording, so we're going to take the opportunity to do it again, basically. So thank you to all three of you for coming back. Lee and Shannon were original panelists, and Tom did a great job as the moderator. I'm here to moderate this time just so that we can give Tom a chance. You've worked with Domain of One's Own and WordPress multi-site, but not simultaneously, I believe. So to get your perspective as someone who's coming at it from a slightly different angle.
Yes.
That about sum it up? Anything I missed?
Me, yeah.
All right. Yeah. So I have prepped some questions, and I've actually swiped a couple from Tom. But we are also taking questions in the Discord, so please put them in the chat. I will be keeping an eye on that. But we're going to just sort of get started with, quintessential first start of a panel question, which is tell us a little bit about yourself, your institution, your history with domains, with WordPress multi-site, general context, backstory, whatever you want to call it.
I guess I'll go first. I'm Lee Scaller-Bissett. I am the Assistant Director for Digital Learning at the Center for New Designs for Learning and Scholarship, also known as CANDLES, at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. We have been doing a WordPress multi-site since 2008. So we were an early adopter of both WordPress multi-site, and we were also one of the first adopters of the Domain of One's Own project. So I've been at my position here at Georgetown for 5 years, so I have 5 years of institutional history about this. But prior to that, I worked for a few years at the University of Mary Washington at the Division of Teaching and Learning Technologies. So I've had experience both at Georgetown, and can speak more about that, but also have experience at Georgetown. At UMW.
Great, thank you. Tom, Shannon? I'm going to have to put one of you on the spot if you don't volunteer.
All right, I'll go. I'm Shannon Hauser. I'm the Associate Director of the Digital Knowledge Center here at the University of Mary Washington. And I feel like I in some ways don't have to give the whole origin story of all this because this is where so much of, Domain of One's Own began. But UMW blogs to Domain of One's Own, and now we're at a place where we're putting them both side by side in a fun, in a different kind of context. So and I've kind of, was there at the very beginnings and then kind of come now on later. I've been in this position for 3-4 years now, however long it's been.
All right, and I am Tom Woodward, the Director of Learning Spaces and Technologies at Middlebury. Previously, I had worked at Virginia Commonwealth University, where we had a very large WordPress multi-site, and now at Middlebury, we have the Domain of One's Own stuff going on, and I'm currently going back through the 2016 accounts, and then now in 2017, getting them straight and deleting old stuff. So I have a lot of immediate experience on some of the stuff that's going on in our Domain of One's Own in the distant past.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you all for this. The next question is actually sort of the same question, but more, which was about how you or your institution, either one or both, got started, first experiences with Domain of One's Own or WordPress multi-site. Maybe even just sort of what the history of your school's web presence offerings were, if you had something before domains, or what you guys were thinking when you adopted it. Or I guess before WordPress multi-site, there's no assumption that domains came first.
Come on, unmute. There we go. I can't speak too much about what happened before, again, because I wasn't there, and it was 2008, which is quite some time at Georgetown. And one of we are also in the process right now of sunsetting our original multi-site and building a new multi-site to launch in the fall. It was called, and so this kind of gives you the history and evolution, I think, and really give you a feel of what 2008 was like versus 2023. So in 2008, we launched what was called the Commons blog, right? So this concept of the Commons was very prominent. It was also one of the only spaces where students and student learning was at the center. So it wasn't a management system, even though WordPress is a content management system, but it was being touted less as a management system and more as a common space, community building, those kinds of things. One of the plugins that we developed that has proven to be extraordinarily popular and is going to have to carry over into the next one is we call it the Hub and Spoke plugin. And so what happens is that we create, there's a plugin and it automatically creates a hub where the faculty member, and again, we have to sort of do this, but the faculty member is the administrator and the students are all authors or contributors on the hub site, which you could say was the central course site. And then there are spokes, and each student gets their own spoke. But the thing about this hub and spoke model is that only students and faculty who are registered in that hub and spoke can see each other's sites. So each student is the administrator on their own site, and all of the other students are viewers of the site, or subscribers, you could say. So they can see everyone else's sites, and they have full control over their own. And this has actually proven really popular in freshman writing courses, where it's a lot of drafting, it's a lot of reflecting, it's a lot of iterating. And so it gives the students an ability to say, well, this is an easy way to share it with my classmates, which we know it can be really clunky in LMSs, discussion boards, not really. So, so it's a space that they can personalize a little bit, but also feel safe in sharing, that the only people who are going to see it. Now, the nice thing about the WordPress multi-site setup is that if they want to, after the class, make it public, that is up to them to do. They can choose to do that. So that is very good for course blogs. It's also proven popular for ePortfolio courses, where it's automatically generated. But the biggest uses for the Commons blog currently, as we're iterating to our next one, is the Hub and Spoke course blogs, just a general course site, and then and also ePortfolios. Whereas because we're an R1 institution, we do need a more robust system like domains for digital humanities, digital scholarship, computer science, all of these kinds of things. And so domains is a little bit less for coursework and a little bit more for research, institutional things, larger scale projects. A great example is that our the Slavery and Reconciliation project at Georgetown University is hosting the slavery archives on domains through an Omeka installation. And so just to give, like, that's probably one of the biggest, most visible or important projects that's going on Domain of One's Own, but that just gives you an idea of like the difference versus very public, large projects versus smaller course. And so that's sort of the differentiation and kind of the evolution of what it's been at Georgetown.
Community versus a sort of not individual, but like private community versus public one-off projects and sites.
Yeah. Or not even one-off, but like longer, you know, that these are you require the capacity of going beyond what a WordPress multi-site can provide for you. Right. But that you need a full hosting account for instead.
Yeah. Something more customized, specialized.
Yeah, exactly.
Great. Tom or Shannon, the history of your work, your institution's work with either domains, WordPress multi-site, both?
I'll give the quick version.
Okay.
Yeah. So, I mean, we have, we'll just do Middlebury. We had the tilde accounts, I think. At some point in the past, we had a centrally created kind of ITS managed multi-site setup. We have 2 of those. They've been migrated now, I think, to Campus Press. They had the usual kind of things that go on with ITS managed stuff where it's like not enough plugins, not enough themes. What if I don't want to use single sign-on in my own name? And that led to the domain of one's own stuff. And that's kind of where we sit now, in that we still have 2 WordPress multi-sites. We still have some tilde, I think, personal account type of options. And then we have the domain of one's own. And I think what we're seeing is like, do we have need for the cloud stuff? Do we want a 3rd multi-site? Where would it fit in this continuum? I think those are all questions that start to come up around this stuff. It's like, how much duplication is too much? What degree of freedom do we really want to support? How many people does that take? So that's where we sit now. Lots of questions.
Yeah. And Shannon, I know you said the history of domains at UMW is pretty well known and well documented. So do you maybe, well, I'm not going to say like don't talk about that, but do you maybe want to talk a little bit more about how WordPress multi-site and domains have sort of integrated with each other over time?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think it came, because of the iteration and kind of experimentation that happened at Mary Washington, right? Like multi-site was like, the DTLT was playing around with Bluehost and WordPress itself. And they were like, how do we make this easier, right? And like multi-site gave them a way to do that. And then from that, it's like, the getting domain of one's own, giving, then being like, okay, what if we wanted to really give people like that full kind of Bluehost experience that we had, right? And moving on from that. And there was, I think, a decision at some point too, to like, all right, this is more powerful. Why, like, let's really push people on domain of one's own. Because honestly, it's work to manage 2 systems, right? Like there's a reality that if you're going to run 2 things in parallel, it's work for somebody to do. But for us, there's partially like a cost thing, but like WordPress multi-site has its place. It's simpler to get started with, right? And we found that like people were kind of avoiding domain of one's own because they're like, it's just too much onboarding for students. Like that, my goal is to have them just write. I don't want all this extra work. So we were like, I think for us, it would, if we can get people to engage in those things, it was going to be worth it, that extra work. And that also meant we probably were going to scale down domain of one's own, which would mean less work in that area. So we're hoping, and so far it's like that work, while having that means there's more of that. Maybe there's less. Like we're down to 2 servers instead of 3 at this point, right? It's like one less thing. So, and multi-site seems to, just because it's limited, people's things don't break in crazy ways. Not yet, at least. I guess on the downside is multi-site. Once something breaks, usually it breaks everybody's stuff versus like, just one person's site that is affected. But I think that's what we're like, hoping that these things can be serve different needs going forward that we have.
Yeah, that's actually a very good sort of transition point into my next question, which is about the differences in users, both in terms of like where you're sort of guiding people to go, talking about WordPress multi-site as a sort of low, whatever the opposite of steeper is, shallower learning curve, versus domains. Lee, you talked about sort of those community private spaces versus the larger projects that need more resources. Have you seen that difference in what users prefer, I guess, in demographics? This is maybe more towards Tom and Shannon for students versus faculty or by department, things like that. But since Lee, you already touched on that.
I don't know if it breaks down for me between students and faculty. It's more like individual orientation. like we have certain faculty who are very aggressive and need a lot of freedom and choice in their environments. We have some students who'd fall in that bucket as well. And at the same time, we have other people who aren't interested in any extra complexity there or challenge. They want whatever the simplest way to get from point A to point B for them is. And they don't want choice. They don't want a long discussion about merits of certain things. They want to get down to business. And those are all valid positions. So it's not as easy for me usually as being able to go like, all right, we're going to shunt this group here. We're going to shunt this group here. It unfortunately gets down to individual discussions and some nuances in what you really want to do. But that alignment of expectation and environment is the key thing. And how much of that can you kind of give to them at the support tier 0 level so they can guide themselves versus it having to happen at, say, tier 1 or unfortunately later on, say at tier 3 when they're unhappy. So trying to manage that escalation of conversations in a sustainable way.
Yeah, I don't think I have anything to add because it's basically the same at our institutions. Like, what are you trying to do? There's plenty of classes we go to where we will present both options to students as well. It's like your professor says you can make a choice about this, and sometimes that works, for what their needs are. Sometimes they want them to use one over the other, but it's like if you're the kind of student that wants to learn a bit more, like try this. If you're like, I just want to do what I need to minimally for this assignment, go use that, So that education kind of process.
We also have the thing about Georgetown too is that there's the issue of branding. Now that might change now that we're going to coursesites.georgetown.domains, but our old address for the Commons blogs was blogs.commons.georgetown.edu/ whatever it is that's going to come afterwards, which can be kind of a mouthful for an e-portfolio, whereas studentname.georgetown.domains, A, is much easier, but B, carries that Georgetown name front and center, and so features the student and saying I went to Georgetown, which is again an important branding thing for the students. It's part of what they're paying for. So there was also that decision that maybe Commons blog would have been better for their purpose because they don't need a huge site, but they wanted the domain name, right? That they really wanted that and needed that because that was something that was really important to them and that would differentiate them on the job market. So we also have that added layer of complexity that comes along with it when it comes to that. And again, because we're changing to something simpler in our new iteration, where again Georgetown is very much centered and we've streamlined that, that might mean that students will go for their portfolios more so to the Commons blog rather than or not the Commons blog, but what we're calling course sites rather than domains. But that's still something that a lot of students and even faculty really want, is they want that Georgetown front and center in the domain name.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I also hadn't even thought about that as like Shannon, you mentioned in the chat that UMW is offering top level domains to their users as this sort of way to put your own name on it or whatever it is that you want. But I hadn't actually thought about it from the angle of users wanting their name to be attached to the university. One of the things that we have for Domain of One's Own is this is for the university, for the institution, this is a branded portal. You can put your name on it and say that this is what we're offering. But I hadn't come to it from that angle of on the user end, sort of the same, but mirrored. Yeah. Let me sort of scroll. We keep touching on things that I already have on my list, which is maybe the sign of a good discussion, just how it's evolving. But I guess maybe we'll jump to working with the administration and sort of where these fit into the larger culture. Lee, you've talked about the WordPress multi-site as a sort of common space for people. But you've also talked about how Georgetown is a relatively large institution, so domains is relatively small by comparison. Domains and WordPress multi-site seem quite embedded into UMW. And I really have no sense of where WordPress multi-site fit at VCU and domains fits at Middlebury in the larger campus ethos, I guess. So coalescing all of that, working with the administration and campus culture around the projects, I guess.
It's still, to my mind, a hidden gem at Georgetown. We just started a digital research initiative, which is a collaboration with the library. Again, huge, right? And so the library has a digital scholarship unit. We support digital pedagogy and some digital scholarship as well, obviously through Domain in One's Own. A lot of the times people will go to the digital scholarship unit and it takes a website, so they recommend Domain in One's Own. But we just started a more in-depth collaboration called the Digital Research Initiative, and just about every single digital project was, oh, hey, you should use domains. And 3/4, if not, 8/10 of the people didn't even know that domains existed. I was at WordPress campus, and there was a former UIS, which is our IT unit at Georgetown, who was doing some consulting work with contacts he still had at Georgetown University, and he even had no idea that domains existed. Where he was talking about these faculty who wanted to make research websites and that, and I was like, oh, well, that's what domains is for. And he's like, tell me about domains. So it's so big that a lot of people still don't know about domains. And I think the same thing about our WordPress multi-site is we have, as we've sort of gone through, we lost a lot of users once we switched from Blackboard to Canvas. A lot of people were using our multi-site because they hated Blackboard, and then Canvas was, not as bad, and it had the integrated grade book and all of these kinds of things. So they kind of abandoned it. So we have a small core set of users on the course sites who are very dedicated to it and use it for their purposes. And so again, we're interested to see, once we've streamlined it, updated it, modernized it, to see what kind of reaction, if it's going to grow in terms of its current user base. So, we're a small part of the institution on both sides, but I think there's room for growth, and the people who are using it are quite robust users and use it quite frequently and really like it. So.
Well, you asked kind of a big and fluid question, at least for me. With administrative turnover and kind of changes in strategic priorities, it can be difficult to say where stuff sits at any one moment. I'd say at a larger institution like VCU, there's a lot more involvement with legal, Office of Counsel, and kind of making sure our ducks were in a row there. And with certain administrative supervision, like when Gardner was there, we know we could take certain risks. We would have backing to certain conversations, but when that leadership changes, things can change pretty dramatically and pretty quickly. So that terms a role. And there's also some complications, like VCU got sued for accessibility issues. And so you had an Office of Civil Rights investigation, and then Rampages ends up getting pulled into that with all the accessibility complications, what can you guarantee, et cetera, et cetera. So, I think it's hard to say. There's some good things, like at one point, all students participating in the first year kind of English type class got a Rampages site, which was awesome. Also, that's a lot of people all of a sudden when they're starting the first year of college, and it's also a highly mobile level of instructors, a lot of adjuncts, a lot of temporary people. And so, you kind of have to think through the ramifications of all this stuff. And it certainly had some performance implications for the site, which is why we went to Reclaim in the first place. So they saved us from me waking up in cold sweats all the time with disasters. But I think it's complex, and you're trying to think about strategy. You're trying to think who should be using this. How do we optimize certain things to be better used? That's one of the things that I think I've like almost gotten right a couple times, but not really. It's never fulfilled itself. Like if we had standardized portfolios for the environmental sciences thing, or a degree of fluidity there about certain data, and then we had a mother site that could, parse through the data and show in certain ways, how cool would that be? There's lots of big procedural things that you could work through that could be really amazing, but getting those conversations to happen at the right time and getting the right people on board long enough to actually come to fruition can be really, really hard.
I think I've lost track of what the question is exactly, but I will say briefly, because I think I remember Tom kind of asking this too, like what is the role of what you do, like of your domain of one's own WordPress multi-site? Is it infrastructure? Is it experimental? And I think on that side of like, I think we're lucky at our small institution that our stuff has always kind of fell into that space more, and really nowadays it's focused on students' classwork. We don't like have, Lee talked about like, there's like this faculty research, like those kinds of things where the library is very involved. We don't really just have that at Mary Washington. They're just like not that, faculty don't engage with it in that particular way, right? They're generally like we have plenty of faculty who do not engage with it, but they make their students engage with it, right? They don't have any interest, but they're like, I think this is important, right? Like, so they're like, okay, like, help them do this thing. And I think a lot of that happens because we have things like the DKC where they can send their students for help, right? Like they're like, well, I don't need to know this. I'll just send them along. So we get a lot more engagement, I think, on that kind of front where it's student work, which has a completely different vibe. And in some ways it's kind of easier to also not worry about long-term if you need to, like, because they're going to be gone after a certain amount of time. So that kind of culling that could happen. I mean, that's what happens with Domain of One's Own. We give them some time, and then we're like, okay, bye. Like, we're not paying for your stuff anymore. So that makes, at least on the Domain of One's Own side, very easy to deprovision people. It's like mass majority of users are students, so bye. Get out. So.
That's actually a very good pivot to something that's been popping up in the chat repeatedly in the past couple minutes. And also, again, a question that I sort of swiped from Tom, which is talking about sunsetting things at your institution on a regular basis, on a larger scale. For Lee and Shannon, you guys are both sunsetting a very large project, but talking about sort of on a smaller scale user annual deprovisioning, keeping track of who's leaving. So for all three of you, particularly on WordPress multi-site, for both, but WordPress multi-site sort of has different ways of keeping track of how many users, how many sites, what's active, what's going on. So how do you guys set those policies, think about those things, and approach deprovisioning, archiving, sunsetting, small scale and large scale?
I mean, currently, to be honest, we don't. Because again, and this is this question of infrastructure, right? Like, this is a small part of our support for digital pedagogy. We also, UIS, and this is the only one that Candles, our unit, actually administers. And so we are also working with faculty on the LMS, and we are working with the LMS integrations and other tools, and we help them with Zoom, whereas UIS takes care of the administration of those sorts of things. We still support them in terms of their implementation in the classroom setting. And so, Domains in the Commons blog is no one person's primary responsibility, right? Which is an issue, right? And so now I am the closest person to having that be one of my main or primary responsibilities. And even then I have a lot of other ones and competing ones. And so one of the things we are actually getting a team of people who can help with these kinds of things and to administer. And so really, we're having to rush through the process of building our new WordPress multi-site because our old WordPress multi-site is broken and insecure and a whole host of other things, which Lauren will tell you all about, trying to get me to shut it down because it's running like PHP 4.5 or something ridiculous like that. Yeah, I know everybody makes that face when I say that. It is not great. It's not. And so we're going through to make sure that we have a functional WordPress multi-site to launch in the fall for new classes, so that we're not adding anybody new on the old one. And the goal is that we kind of have three, again, because of its long-term use and it's been around for so long. Most of the users, it's course blogs, but we do have a not insignificant number of units on campus, and we found this with UMW blogs as well, Shannon, right? Like there are some units on campus who have been using it since 2008 as their units blog and website. A couple of major units on campus. We have faculty who are using that as their faculty page, as their professional page. So while we're not going to create any new users, we are planning on, and we have to keep student work for 3 years, which is the law everywhere. So we're giving ourselves a year of time to sort of make sure that anyone who still needs web space is migrated to the right place, be that on an official georgetown.edu, be that on domains, maybe it is a new course site, right? And just to really make sure and do that hand holding. And then we're also going to have to take the time to create the policies. We're kind of putting the cart before the horse because of the circumstances, unfortunately. But our plan is to develop a plan and have a more consistent cycle of deletion and removal. Part of that is, again, made complicated by the fact that student work has to be kept for 3 years. And so we have to kind of think about that cycle and how that's going to work, and build that into our way of dealing with domains as well, right? What do we do with graduations, staff leaving, all of that kind of stuff. So there's an increased capacity now that in the fall we're going to be, once this is all built up and we're ready to go with it, we can sit down and have a longer conversation about, okay, what's the life cycle, right? What does our year look like? How do we make sure that this doesn't become something that's going to break and compromise Reclaim servers in the future? Sorry, Reclaim. We love you.
Yeah, I wish I could say that we had a hard and fast policy right now with our WordPress multi-site. We definitely went into it yeah, the problem with UMW blogs is that we never deleted anything, and then you get around to thinking about what it takes to actually do that effectively, and you're like, oh, this is probably why they never got around to figuring this out. Besides the value of having that stuff, it's a little trickier because if an individual student owns a site, that's easy. But what do you do about do you get rid of, if you got rid of a student's site, do you get rid of the user? They might have been blogging on somebody. Does that content go away when they were blogging on their professors? It gets, because those things can be a little more connected, it gets a little bit harder to untangle. So I think we'll definitely I think we'll do the low hanging fruit of if it ever only said hello world, that seems like an easy thing to get rid of. But we are, I think, still figuring out what it means to it's not even just the practicality of deleting things, but what due diligence do you need to do in notifying people, and that kind of those things that we are still wrestling with on what might be best practice for us. So
yeah, I think if it was an easy answer, people would have one and it would be consistent, but it's not, and it's nuanced, and there's lots of hassle even within a multi-site. And I think, I'm, like I said, digging through 2016 and 2017 domain of one's own accounts right now. So I know that any student contact in there is not going to work. And so what we are doing is myself am hand backing up any installed applications, looking to see if the public HTML directories have been added and archiving those if they exist, and just pulling it all down locally before saying delete the account. So just in case, we'll have all the stuff in case someone cares. And I'm hitting all the, like, a lot of them I can do pretty quick, you know, minute and a half, 2 minutes. But then you hit somebody who has like 6 applications installed and like 5 folders, and it's like, plus I'm saving them all to my Google Drive. So eventually I'll have to like move them someplace, and we'll have to document like where they are and share that folder. So I mean, like, it's you know, it's nutty stuff. And you don't have to care. That's the other thing you could do, is just say, you've been gone for X amount of time, we're going to delete your stuff. But it depends on the culture of the institution. And Middlebury's culture is not, we're going to delete your stuff and tough luck. It's, oh dear, you're unhappy, we will do anything to make you happy. So, you know the vibe of your institution, and try to line stuff up to support that.
Yeah. I always like hearing about what different institution cultures are around the projects, because that's part of what I'm trying to do. And yet sometimes it can be hard to get a sense for these things. So thank you guys for sharing that.
Yeah, I would say, like, for anybody who, you know, is thinking about this or trying to spin up, it's like it's so hard to feel like to have these conversations, because it is so dependent on what is your culture like? What are the goals of your institution around these things? Where do you think you're going to go? So it's like, what works for Lee's group doesn't work for us, because that doesn't make sense. So I don't know. There's lots of ways to do it, which means that there's lots of right answers, but you know, sometimes it feels like, well, nobody else is doing this. Is this okay? Like, I have had many moments of like, nobody else is doing this. I don't know if this is a good decision or not. So
I would say an added layer of complexity that I just remembered in terms of our WordPress multi-site is one of the reasons why the hub and spoke model was popular with some faculty and some programs, is that you can't add external users or viewers to the LMS, but you could add them to the hub and spoke model of our WordPress multi-site. And so if they had external experts coming in to evaluate student work, to comment, to sort of not guest lecture, but guest sort of mentor, there was no way to do that in the LMS. But there is a way to do that in the hub and spoke model. So it's still private, but you can bring, as you choose, external users. That makes it complicated, because now we don't just have Georgetown users on our WordPress multi-site, but external users. We actually have, I mean, I don't know how many of them are really active at the moment, but a couple hundred external people that then we have to account for and figure out, well, what do we do with them as users and their content? And how do we reach out to them and hope that Hotmail address still works? So it's, again, it's that very, and that's also what happens, though, is that it's going on in the chat, and we talked about it here. Each place is so dependent, but so many of us spun up multi-sites or domains, and you know, it's saying in the chat, we just sort of went, okay, let's see what people do with it, right? And so we have this 15 years of data, right, of like, this is how these sites have been used. And so in the next iteration, we can kind of say, we know this is how people have used it, and so we can tailor our build towards how our users are using it. Like I said, that's why, you know, we're trying to create this hub and spoke plugin, because it has become such a central part of the WordPress multi-site experience at Georgetown University. And so that's the kind of, you know, as we all move into the 2.0, we are better able to respond to what our campuses want and need, because we were able to do such an open-ended version of it at the beginning. As unsustainable as that turned out to be, and maybe we should have predicted that. But now we can take this knowledge of our campus, of the community, of the needs, and our own capacity, and say, okay, here's how we're going to do it moving forward, which I think is a really fantastic element of both the WordPress multi-site and domain of one's own is that we do have the flexibility to adapt it and adopt it to our own campus's needs and capacity, which isn't the case in the LMS, right? The LMS is just like, here, you get Canvas and it's your solution, regardless of how big you are, regardless of what your needs are, regardless of anything else. Whereas this can be the exact opposite of it, which I think is phenomenal.
Yeah, that's actually what you guys have sort of been talking about, of differences also in campus culture, which is, heading back a second, is related to something I have on my list. So we're going to go to that next, which is things that you've picked up from other institutions. So if there's differences in campus culture, it can be maybe hard to say, oh, what works for you will work for us. But are there other schools out there using domains, using WordPress multi-site, using both, where you've looked at it and said, maybe we try that? Maybe we can bring that in, or maybe we can adapt that.
Well, certainly, I think OU's creatives, like having an actual physical ceremony to celebrate digital stuff, is one that's always stuck with me as something that I really liked. Making it to like an occasion. It's a hard thing to maintain, clearly, but like, always like that idea. I like the pushing back and forth of digital and physical that it kind of pulls off, and the idea of creating community, that extends the digital community that might exist. So that was one that really has always stuck out to me. But, I also went through and looked at, I don't remember how many, the domain of one's own pages in terms of like getting ideas and thinking things through. So like, while I can't call out individuals, I can say that I do look across at all this stuff and how it's happening, to try and get ideas, to try and better frame language. And I guess the other one that a number of people have done in different ways is that idea of how do you show examples of what happens in the space to people at the right time, to help kind of inform their choice of spaces if they were choosing between domain of one's own and say multi-site, but also kind of inspire them to go down different paths in different ways.
I'll quickly give credit. Like early on, I took a lot of stuff from Coventry just around their guides, and then like they were the first group that like I think when we were contemplating what we were going to do, I'm sure it's Lauren's, but Jim was like, Coventry is figuring out how to put they're going to offer both things. I was like, oh, like the thought that had never occurred to me, like we could offer both things. Like it seemed like a false dichotomy that I had in mind. And I'll say like one thing I think, that like we wrestled with, that we did end up choosing not to go that direction, but like part of my heart still wants it. Like, let's get a third WordPress multi-site, is like what CUNY does with like they use comments in a box, like that kind of more that feeling of like you're part of a network more, right? Like some people really approach the WordPress multi-site as a network of like groups and discoverable. I mean, the way we've decided to approach our WordPress multi-site is really more of like, this is an easier way to build a site rather than it's a way to network among people. But I really love the idea. Like that's what I loved about early UMW blogs. Like I would spend time like looking at what people were writing. It felt like a comments, and I guess there's ways we could do that on our multi-site, but we've really not focused on it in that particular way. That I think is an element I miss, but is like we've kind of focused it as more of a tool than to accomplish a thing rather than maybe a community, which that doesn't have to be like that forever, but it's like I miss that aspect, I think.
When I was at UMW, one of the things that we tried to do was we tried to capture the early histories of domain of one's own at various institutions. And I'll share, I was looking for the article while they were talking. And so it's kind of interesting to think of like, what have we taken from other places? And I want to say like everything, right? Where it's just thinking everything from plugins to usage to themes to approaches for faculty development. I mean, even just going to the Reclaim Open conference, and I just got the notification for the St. Norbert domains camp. Where taking the idea of how to do faculty development differently, how to integrate students, and then thinking about it as the biggest challenge is how do I adapt and adopt this for our particular institution and situation. So it's everything from like, how are we doing the infrastructure? Well, the first person I reached out to when we were rebuilding our multi-site was Shannon, and being like, you guys went through this. How did it go? So the very nitty gritty technical questions. And if you're on the Discord, I'm on there a lot, and Tom always answers me. Thank you, Tom. Again, how do we do faculty development? How do we involve students in this? How do we scale? From the nitty gritty to the existential. I think it's just I've taken so much from the community in that sort of sense, and learning from what everybody else has done.
That's really lovely. I don't know. I like that. Thank you. Now I have to figure out how to pivot off of that great note and ruin the moment, and I'm so sorry. I think what we're going to move to next is another question that I swiped from Tom. So thank you, Tom. Which is just real quick elevator pitch, difference between a domain of one's own and WordPress multi-site, how you would talk about them to a potential user.
All right, I'll give you my spiel. It's about how much complexity you want. So here, a WordPress multi-site route is going to be it's managed to you to a degree. We're going to be able to provide you this level of support here technically. We're going to have pre-chosen themes, pre-chosen plugins, which you can choose from. So there is choice, there is flexibility. We're kind of building it to solve, say, 80-90% of the things that most people want to do. And with full site editing and some other options we might apply, you can have something that is unique within the space. But if you're going to be wanting to install software that's different, if you want to look behind the curtain and start to look at like databases, if you want to be doing things that kind of start to push the boundaries, and you're possibly dealing with something that might have a degree of scale and might need to move someplace else, this is probably a better place to go for that. So we won't be able to provide support in terms of X, Y, and Z, whatever that is at your institution. Our stuff is not defined. It's super fuzzy. But from here, you would also be able to move more easily to, say, a cloud environment or a full-on virtual server or something like that. So try and talk about it in terms of the complexity they want or don't want, the technology complexity they want or don't want, the support they want or don't want, and then the scale that they anticipate the thing having.
Yeah, I mean, Tom kind of just put it the way we often talk about that. We have our very fancy apartment versus like plot of land thing that we go that is kind of the way I easily break it down. Like if I'm doing a class visit, right? Like, in front of people. So I don't know if I have anything else to add to what Tom just said.
I think it's in a lot of cases, again, just given the scale of our project and the size of the institution, in a lot of cases, people are coming to us about wanting to build a website. And then it's or having a web presence or doing something publicly, and then it becomes, sometimes it's, no, you don't actually want a Georgetown domain. This is actually, you should be on georgetown.edu, and you need to contact UIS. Like, you're a department, have a department website. That's a much easier conversation to have since we shifted it on our official georgetown.edu from Drupal to WordPress. It's much easier to have that conversation now because they're not trying to avoid Drupal like the plague, which cool, I get that. And then sometimes it becomes, is it for a class project? What are you trying to do? What's the scalability? I think I put it in the chat. It's like, do you want to use WordPress? Yes or no? And then what do you want to do with WordPress? Because if they're not going to use WordPress and they want to Mecca or Scala or something like that, well, then we're going to have to use domains, even if it's for a class, right? Because that's the whole purpose of it. And then if it's, if it's a business program and they want to create e-commerce sites, well, then we're going on domains and not on commons. So in a lot of cases, it's kind of, so you want to build a website. Okay. What kind, where, how are we doing this? And so there's almost like a decision tree of like what it is that we want to do. So it's less of a pitch and more that they come to us. And that's, again, something that we have to work on in terms of promoting domain in one zone and WordPress multi-site is like, how do we pitch this rather than just use it as something that's a reaction?
Great. Our next question is actually going to be from the chat from Mark Corbett Wilson. Thank you, Mark, which is about the role of students in these discussions. He asked, any student input in these institutional discussions, democratically elected leaders might have different points of view.
I mean, Georgetown is so big and so varied, where what kind of students are you talking about? Are you talking about the undergraduate students or the graduate students? Are you talking about continuing studies students at the School of Continuing Studies who are professional students? I mean, are we talking about the medical students or the law students? I mean, it's Georgetown is so big, and again, because anyone can use it, right? You could say the same thing as what do faculty want? Because our faculty are probably the bigger, more long-term users of domain in one zone than they would be of the WordPress multi-site, right? Or maybe not, right? Like, again, I'd have to crunch those numbers. But again, like understanding who our user base is and who are we serving, and it's one thing to say anyone with a net ID, faculty, students, staff, because staff is in this too, and gosh, we've got thousands of staff as well at our institution. Like who is, if everyone is our constituents, we're never going to be able to make everyone happy, and that's completely unsustainable. So in a lot of cases it becomes really hard to respond to just students in terms of what their needs are versus needs of the faculty versus possibly needs of the staff. So that becomes, it gets a little bit muddled and very complicated. And again, different student populations want very different things as well even within our student ecosystem at a place as large as Georgetown.
My quick answer would be no, they're not really involved in a lot of those discussions. And I think it is for all the reasons that Lee just mentioned. I feel like to some degree, when you're trying to get at the food, water, shelter type of thing, then the student input almost feels like it's going to add extra complexity when you can't support the complexity you already have. And I also recognize that's like a cowardly, self-injurious type of position to take, perhaps. So I can kind of appreciate it on both sides, that we really should have students talking through this stuff with us on a regular basis. But at the same time, it seems like an almost insurmountable hill at the moment. Like I wouldn't even want to talk to faculty in general about this, just because that's going to open up another ball of wax that we just don't seem to have the financial, personnel, or infrastructure to support. And so you just limp along with what you have, I think, in many cases, which isn't an aspirational model, but I feel like that's where it is sometimes.
But before Shannon goes, sorry, just to add to that, we were talking in the discussion earlier about how you know, the students want something .georgetown.domains. And then Tom asked, well, how long does that last? I go, oh, only 6 months after they graduate. And there's, you know, so if students had their say, because I've gotten the feedback from students when I do class visits, because that's always the question they ask, how long do I have this for? And then, well, why can't I keep it forever? And you know, the answer is that it is not sustainable. Right? As we just talked about with the WordPress multi-sites being able to be kept forever. So, I mean, if we ask the students what they wanted, they're like, I want that domain name forever. That's sort of like, okay, we can't do that. Right? Like it's again, it's this, what are we actually, and it, once you ask and they tell you, it's hard to say no. Right? It's hard to kind of justify the infrastructure and all of that kind of stuff. Whereas if we build within the limitations that we have and we know of, it's not necessarily democratic, but it's the best that we've got within the institutional constraints that we all kind of deal with, both culturally, but also in terms of resources. Right? If we want something that does everything for everyone, then you've got Canvas. Right? Like, have the LMS.
Yeah. I'll echo that. We don't either. You know, we barely bring faculty into some of our decisions. Like the people who understand these things. You know, we certainly we bring in, I think, the stakeholders we think can represent those kinds of things, right? We have faculty, we bring in faculty who understand those things and then can maybe speak to their interaction with students around this. I think because I actually really don't I've actually seen too much bad use of let's involve students to by just inviting students but not helping them actually be useful people in those conversations at all. And it's hard to actually make a student understand enough, right? Like they don't understand how institutions work, right? You know, they complain about tuition's too high, but then why don't we have this thing? You're like, well, that costs money. That's to have meaningful integration of students into conversations, which I think is worthwhile in places, you have to help them get there. And it's just not priority, I think. And for me, I'd rather spend my time with students talking about how can we do interesting things with the tool that, Domain of One's Own is complex enough that we could spend all our time. Let's talk about, what does it mean to be online? Your digital identity. Those are the conversations I'd rather spend time doing with students, meaningful interrogations of the tool rather than them maybe giving input about some of the machinations that go on behind it. Let's you want to put on this workshop around accessibility on the web. I'd rather do that than do other things. And there's only so much time in the day, it feels like, for things.
Yeah. We have, just about over 2 minutes left. Great. I have so many questions still on my list. And I have a couple that I can bring in, but first I just want to say, is there anything that I didn't get to that you would like to say? And if the answer is, I don't know, that's too open-ended, and I have stuff. Okay, we're going to say that's too open-ended. My bad. So we talked about past, we talked about present, we talked a little bit about future. I want to go a little more into that. You have a minute and a half. What is your crazy dream for your projects in a world with infinite resources and infinite support?
No more WordPress and flat HTML. Small, my minimal computing thing. Go watch that talk. That's my dream for the future. That I'm not dealing with WordPress unless I absolutely have to, in the same way we now only deal with Drupal if we absolutely have to. It's let's just get it small. Let's go back to flat HTML. Let's just simplify this whole thing so much more.
I have still more questions if I've put you on the spot.
I'm unmuted, but I don't know if I have an answer. Yeah, I think I'm just I think, basically what Reclaim Open was about, what is going to happen with the open web into the future. I think right? We often get caught up in these tools, but like, what is going to be next? I don't know. Maybe there's going to be crazy tools that are like, well, now you just have AI generate your site by telling it to what to do, right? I don't like, but how do we stay in those conversations with the tools that are going to be the next thing to make sure we are ethically and responsibly, building and authoring on the web and using these tools. So I don't know if I have an answer so much as like, I don't know. I'm just prepared to like, where are we going next? Trying to keep the eyes open, also to prevent bad actors from like being like, this is how we should do it. And we can resist whatever awfulness may come.
And I think it's just having the time and space for the conversations to enable choice that's informed. Like WordPress is great for being WordPress. There's lots of reasons to have database-backed websites. We just often like using a hammer to eat your lunch. You chose the wrong tool. It's a great hammer. It's good at that, but like you wanted a fork and the hammer just doesn't make sense. You can make it work, but it's awkward and people look at you funny. So I think it's like, it's more around the time to have the conversations and to help people learn and to have those people actually have the time themselves to do that and want to do it. And so like, that's the tension in all this is like the tools and the choices and all the complexities there are usually an afterthought and they're a penalty rather than being part of the process. So I'd like to change that.
Great. Well, yeah, we're at time. So thank you all so much for taking the time to be part of this panel for the second time, for doing it twice over. This has been a really good conversation from my perspective, and I hope it has been for you guys as well. Happy Friday, by the way. We're going to say goodbye. We're going to end the broadcast and have a great day, everybody.
Have a great day. Have a great